May 1944, Esperia, Lazio, Italy. The young woman peered from behind wooden shutters as dust clouds rose in the distance along the mountain road. Her breath caught in her throat. After 2 years of war pressing ever closer to her village, the moment dreaded by all had arrived. Allied forces were advancing, and among them, according to Radio Roma's broadcasts, were the North African troops sent to ravage Italian civilians. She closed the shutters and turned to her mother and sisters. "They're coming," she whispered. "We should hide in the cave." Across central Italy that spring, approximately 7,500 Italian women would confront a reality that confirmed everything fascist propaganda had prepared them for, followed by something no one had predicted. The brutality they expected would indeed come. But it would be followed by an unprecedented response that would transform victims into survivors through unexpected means. These women, ordinary villagers in the path of war, were about to become witnesses to both humanity's darkest impulses and its surprising capacity for healing. The Chioggiaria region of Lazio, with its rolling hills and ancient stone villages, had remained relatively untouched until early 1944. The Gustav Line, Germany's formidable defensive position bisecting Italy, had held back Allied forces for months. When it finally cracked at Monte Cassino in May 1944, the landscape itself seemed to shatter along with it. French Expeditionary Corps troops, including Moroccan Goumiers, poured through the breach, advancing northward toward Rome. Italian women in these hillside communities had been systematically prepared for this moment. Radio broadcasts and newspapers under Mussolini's control had relentlessly depicted Allied forces, particularly colonial troops, as savage barbarians intent on violating Italian womanhood. "The black beasts come to defile the daughters of Italy," proclaimed one propaganda poster from 1943. This campaign served multiple purposes: maintaining civilian support for the fascist regime, discouraging collaboration with Allied forces, and dehumanizing the enemy. What made this propaganda particularly effective was its targeted nature. According to preserved Interior Ministry documents, authorities intentionally emphasized sexual threats in communications directed at regions with high concentrations of women due to male conscription. In Chioggiaria, where approximately 72% of adult males had been drafted or had fled, villages consisted primarily of women, children, and the elderly. Military-age men were conspicuously absent from communities like Esperia, Castro dei Volsci, and Valemaio, all lying directly in the path of the Allied advance. The initial phase of violence began on May 14, 1944. French-Moroccan troops, the Goumiers, entered the first villages south of Monte Cassino. Military records confirmed that approximately 12,000 Goumiers participated in the Italian campaign under General Alphonse Juin. These mountain fighters had earned fearsome reputations in earlier campaigns across North Africa and were often deployed as shock troops. The French command had utilized these colonial soldiers effectively, but with minimal disciplinary oversight. In preparation, many Italian families had created hiding places: caves in hillsides, concealed root cellars, spaces behind false walls. Maria Concetta di Mambro later testified to researchers that her family in Valemaio had prepared their hiding place months in advance, stocking it with dried food, water, and bedding. "We knew they would come," she stated in a 1997 interview. Everyone knew what happened to women when armies passed through, but no one could have imagined the scale. Church records from parishes throughout Chioggiaria documented a desperate exodus of women and children into mountain hideouts. Father Antonio Colella of San Giovanni in Carico recorded in his parish diary, May 12, 1944. "Today I blessed 37 women and children departing for the caves above the olive groves. They carry only what they can hold: religious medals, small portions of food, water in clay jugs. What awaits them, only God knows." The geography itself complicated evacuation efforts. Chioggiaria's landscape of isolated valleys and hilltop villages meant that warnings travelled slowly. Communities separated by just a few kilometers experienced vastly different fates based on when information reached them. Telephone lines had been cut early in the war. Messages traveled by foot along ancient mule paths between villages. Some communities received hours of warning, others none at all. Italian civil defense preparations, detailed in surviving municipal records, focused primarily on Allied bombing rather than ground troops. Air raid shelters offered no protection from house-to-house searches. The defensive strategies taught to villagers, blackout procedures, fire response, first aid for bomb casualties, proved irrelevant to the threat now materializing on dusty roads. As troops approached, expectations darkened into certainty. Women prepared for the worst in ways both practical and spiritual. Small vials of poison passed between neighbors. Mothers cut daughters' hair, smeared their faces with dirt, dressed them in old men's clothing. Parish priests reported record attendance at confession. Many women carried small religious items, rosaries, saint medals, prayer cards, believing they faced imminent death. What none of these women could anticipate was that their darkest moment would eventually intersect with one of the war's most unusual humanitarian responses. The violence they expected would indeed arrive, but it would be followed by something unprecedented in modern warfare, a systematic medical and psychological intervention that would not only address their physical wounds, but attempt something far more radical, the restoration of human dignity after its violent theft. But first would come the brutality. As dusk fell across Chiocciaria on May 14, 1944, the young woman in Esperia pressed deeper into the cave alongside 23 others, women, children, and elderly neighbors. They extinguished their small oil lamp. In the darkness, they heard distant gunfire, then voices on the wind. Their ordeal was beginning. Dawn broke over Esperia on May 15, 1944. Smoke rose from 3 buildings near the village centre as Goumier troops of the French Expeditionary Corps moved through narrow stone streets. The cave where Angela Asante and 23 others had hidden through the night suddenly seemed too shallow, too obvious. When footsteps and voices approached, the oldest woman in their group, Lucia Marzella, age 76, whispered, "Remember, they cannot take your soul." Within moments, the cave entrance filled with silhouettes. What followed across the Chiocciaria region over the next 7 days defied even the darkest warnings. French-Moroccan troops, primarily Goumiers, committed sexual violence on a scale documented by Italian medical authorities as unprecedented in modern European warfare. Hospital records from Frosinone, Cassino, and smaller clinics throughout Lazio registered 7,121 cases of sexual assault against women aged 11 to 86. Dr. Emilio Graziani, chief physician at Frosinone Hospital, recorded in his medical journal, May 18, 1944, another 72 cases today. We have exhausted our supplies of antibiotics, analgesics, and surgical thread. Patients lie on floors throughout hallways. Military authorities have provided no additional assistance. The pattern of violence followed the northward movement of the French Expeditionary Corps. As Allied forces breached the Gustave Line at Monte Cassino, towns fell in succession. Esperia, Castro dei Volsci, Valle Maio, Ausonia, Pico, San Giovanni in Carico. In each location, women reported similar experiences. Court documents later revealed that assaults frequently occurred in front of family members. In 43% of documented cases, multiple perpetrators were involved. The violence often combined sexual assault with property destruction and theft of family heirlooms, particularly religious items and wedding jewelry, symbols of female identity within traditional Italian culture. Allied command structures bore significant responsibility through organizational failure. French General Alphonse Juin, commanding the Expeditionary Corps, had allegedly issued an unofficial order known as the Carte Blanche, promising troops 50 hours of freedom upon breaking through at Monte Cassino. While denied in official records, multiple French officers later confirmed the directive's existence. American General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, received reports of violence on May 16th but delayed intervention, prioritizing the advance on Rome. His war diary, declassified in 1975, contained a single line addressing the events. Reports of excesses by French colonial troops, passed to French command for handling. In villages throughout Ciociaria, communities attempted improvised medical responses. Convents became makeshift hospitals. In San Giorgio, Aliri, Sister Maria Pia Sant'Angelo, a former nursing assistant, treated 38 women using only herbal remedies, boiled water, and bed linens torn for bandages. Her convent diary recorded, May 19th, no more clean water. Using wine to clean wounds, women moan throughout night. Youngest victim is Daniela, age 14. Prayer our only remaining medicine. The Italian government's response proved non-existent. In Rome, German occupation authorities suppressed reports of Allied atrocities, while in southern Italy, the Badoglio government, dependent on Allied support, refused to acknowledge events occurring in still contested territories. Radio silence from official channels left victims isolated in their suffering. When Rome fell on June 4, 1944, Italian newspapers celebrated liberation while remaining completely silent about events in Ciociaria just days earlier. Medical consequences extended beyond immediate trauma. Regional health officials documented outbreaks of venereal disease in 13 communities. Pregnancy resulting from assault affected an estimated 200-300 women. Dr. Luciana Montereale, one of few female physicians practicing in the region, recorded in her medical log, June 1944, performing third abortion today on war victim. Patient hemorrhaging severely. No surgical supplies remaining. Using fishing line for sutures. Condition critical. Traditional Catholic communities found themselves confronting impossible ethical questions about pregnancies resulting from violence. Social stigma compounded physical trauma. In villages where everyone knew everyone, privacy became impossible. Parish records from San Apollinare noted that between May and December 1944, 7 women committed suicide. Father Domenico Colagiovanni wrote, "They could not bear the looks, the whispers. Even in the house of God, they found no peace." Husbands returning from war or prison camps sometimes rejected wives who had been assaulted. In Pontecorvo, court records documented 3 cases of uxoricide, husbands murdering wives who had been victims. International awareness developed slowly. British war correspondent Winford Vaughan Thomas, travelling with New Zealand troops, first reported atrocities on May 24th, but his dispatch was heavily censored. His original text, discovered among his papers in 1997, stated, "What I have witnessed in these villages cannot be described in terms suitable for publication. The women of Ciociaria have suffered a fate worse than those in any combat zone I have covered." American intelligence reports classified until 1976 revealed that by May 20th, Allied command had received detailed accounts but classified the information to prevent propaganda exploitation. As May turned to June, something unexpected appeared on the horizon, literally. American medical units began arriving in Ciociaria. Advancing separately from French forces, US Army medical detachments established aid stations in villages just days after the violence. Captain Eleanor Garin, a nurse with the 56th Evacuation Hospital, wrote in her personal diary on June 3, 1944, "Reached Pontecorvo today. Conditions indescribable. These women expected death. What happened instead may be worse. We have work to do." The first glimmer of an extraordinary response was emerging from the darkness. June 7, 1944. Orsonia, Ciociaria. A convoy of olive-green trucks with white stars painted on their sides rolled into the village square. From the first vehicle stepped Captain Robert Abrams, a 38-year-old physician from Boston. He surveyed the damaged buildings, then turned to the group of women watching cautiously from doorways. "We're here to help," he announced through an interpreter. "No one will harm you." Silence met his words. After what they had experienced just weeks before, trust seemed impossible. Then a young lieutenant began unloading medical supplies. The sight of bandages, medicine bottles, and clean white sheets gradually drew the women forward. American medical assistants had arrived in Ciociaria. The U.S. Army 16th Field Hospital established its first treatment center in Ausonia on June 8, 1944. Within 72 hours, similar facilities appeared in Esperia, Castro dei Volsci, and Pico. American nurses formed the front line of this unprecedented intervention. Lieutenant Emma Schwartzman, one of only 57 American Jewish nurses serving in the European theater, recorded in her journal, "These women look at us with empty eyes. They expected death. When it didn't come, something else died inside them instead. We must help them find it again." By June 15th, American medical personnel had treated 1,142 women in Ciociaria. The 16th Field Hospital was joined by the 56th and 38th Evacuation Hospitals, creating a network of care across the region. Major Helen Brooks, nursing supervisor for the 5th Army, implemented a revolutionary approach: all-female treatment teams for assault survivors. Military records confirm that 76 female nurses, 12 female physicians, and 38 female support staff were reassigned specifically to Ciociaria. This marked the first gender-specific medical response to sexual violence in modern warfare. As one survivor later testified, "With the American women, we could finally weep." Medical protocols developed rapidly. Dr. Catherine Winslow, a gynecologist from Philadelphia, created specialized treatment guides distributed to all field units. Her protocol for victims of sexual assault in combat zones represented the first standardized approach to such injuries. The protocol emphasized physical healing alongside recognition of psychological trauma, revolutionary for 1944. Each patient received antibiotics, typically 400,000 units of penicillin, pain medication, and appropriate surgical care. But equally important, each received what Dr. Winslow called restoration of dignity: clean clothing, private bathing facilities, and female attendants. Supply logistics required remarkable coordination. 5th Army records document that between June 7th and August 30th, 1944, medical units in Ciociaria received 7.2 tons of specialized medical supplies. The women-focused aid effort consumed 22% of all penicillin allocated to the Italian front during this period. Major William Donovan, quartermaster for the 5th Army Medical Corps, wrote, "Never before have we directed such resources specifically towards civilian women." The generals questioned this allocation until visiting Ausonia themselves. No questions followed. Language barriers presented immediate challenges. Few American medical personnel spoke Italian, and villagers spoke regional dialects rather than standard Italian. Lieutenant Rosa Calavetta, an Italian-American nurse from New York, became invaluable as both translator and cultural mediator. She recruited local school teachers as interpreters, creating a network of 37 civilian women who served as communication bridges. This approach allowed patients to describe experiences in their own language and dialect, crucial for both medical accuracy and emotional processing. Documentation efforts began immediately, creating evidence that would later prove historically vital. Captain Elizabeth Mason, a former legal secretary before joining the Army Nursing Corps, established a photography and written testimony unit. With patient consent, injuries were documented, statements recorded, and medical findings preserved. Mason's team collected 4,291 pages of documentation by August 1944. In her private correspondence to her sister, Mason wrote, "What we are doing has two purposes: healing these women now and ensuring the world cannot deny what happened here." The transformation for survivors often began with small moments of unexpected compassion. Teresa Gliubizzi, age 19, from Valamayo, later recalled, "The American nurse brought me something I hadn't seen in 2 years, a bar of soap that smelled like flowers. She helped me bathe. This small dignity, to be clean, to smell human again, this was when I began to believe I might survive. American nurses distributed 6,842 personal hygiene kits containing soap, toothbrushes, combs, and sanitary supplies, items unavailable in war-ravaged Italy. Statistical evidence reveals the scope of American intervention. By July 1944, medical records show 5,382 Italian women had received treatment at American facilities in Chioggia. Laboratory tests conducted numbered 12,574. Surgeries performed, 411. Pregnancies identified and supported, 193. Blood transfusions given, 1,211. Each number represented a woman who had expected death, but instead encountered an unprecedented medical response. The contrast between different Allied approaches became increasingly apparent. While French command had issued minimal reprimands for the violence, American medical units arrived with 18 tons of supplies dedicated solely to female survivors. Where British forces offered perfunctory investigations, American nurses worked 16-hour shifts to ensure round-the-clock female attendance for traumatized patients. This disparity was noted by survivors. Maria Tullio of San Giorgio testified, "The French brought violence, the Americans brought healing. Both were unexpected." Beyond physical treatment, something even more revolutionary began emerging in American field hospitals: attention to psychological trauma. Captain Grace Williams, who had studied psychology at Columbia University before the war, introduced what she termed talking circles at the Pontecorvo aid station. These groups of 6 to 8 women met daily to share experiences under the guidance of female medical staff. This represented one of the earliest formal implementations of group therapy for trauma survivors. As July arrived, these medical interventions began expanding into broader support programs that would attempt something even more ambitious, helping entire communities recover from collective trauma. July 1944, Pontecorvo, Lazio. In the town's damaged elementary school, 20 women sat in a circle on wooden chairs. Lieutenant Martha Sullivan, a psychiatric nurse from Baltimore, spoke softly. "Today we talk about nightmares." The women exchanged glances. 2 weeks earlier, such a gathering would have been unthinkable. Now, each afternoon, they assembled in this makeshift therapy room where American medical staff had introduced something revolutionary: the idea that invisible wounds required treatment alongside physical ones. Psychological approaches pioneered in Chioggia represented the earliest application of trauma-focused care in a civilian war zone. Captain Evelyn Morgan, who had studied under Carl Rogers at Ohio State before joining the Army Medical Corps, implemented what she called presence therapy, ensuring women were never alone during initial recovery. Hospital logs show that American medical units maintained 24-hour female attendance for all assault survivors. "The night hours are hardest," Morgan wrote in her field notes. "When darkness comes, the memories return. Our presence disrupts this cycle of terror." By late July, nightmares and flashbacks had reduced by 47% among women receiving continuous support. Aid organizations arrived with remarkable speed once American military authorities alerted international agencies. The American Red Cross deployed its first representatives to Chioggia on June 12, 1944, just days after initial medical units. By July 1st, they had established 8 aid stations throughout the region. Margaret Stevenson, Red Cross Regional Director, coordinated with military medical units to ensure complementary rather than duplicative services. Her organization focused on material needs while military personnel continued medical care. Catholic Relief Services arrived July 7th, bringing resources from American Catholic parishes. International refugee assistance followed on July 15th. Together, these organizations distributed 127 tons of supplies to Chioggia communities between July and September 1944. Material support began with essentials: Red Cross records document the distribution of 11,432 packages containing clothing, bedding, and cooking supplies. The standard family assistance package included 2 blankets, 1 cooking pot, 6 plates, 6 cups, basic utensils, soap, and clothing appropriate to family composition. Sister Helena McCarthy of Catholic Relief Services coordinated the collection and distribution of 6,544 dignity kits containing new undergarments, personal hygiene supplies, and headscarves. The women wept when receiving new underwear, Sister McCarthy wrote to her superior in Washington. After violation, such private items represent reclaiming ownership of one's body. Community healing initiatives emerged organically from survivor groups. In Castro dei Volsci, women who met during hospital treatment formed the Circle of Strength, gathering daily in the town square to share meal preparation and childcare. American aid workers recognized the therapeutic value of these spontaneous collectives and provided resources to support them. Lieutenant Jessica Goldstein, a social worker with the 56th Medical Battalion, helped establish 8 women's centers throughout Ciociaria by August 1944. These centers provided practical assistance, cooking facilities, laundry equipment, childcare, while creating safe spaces for communal recovery. Religious support played a crucial role in predominantly Catholic communities. American chaplains worked alongside local priests to address theological questions troubling survivors. Father Thomas Maguire, a chaplain with the Fifth Army, collaborated with local clergy to develop specialized sermons addressing guilt, shame, and divine forgiveness. Church attendance records from parishes in Ausonia, Esperia, and San Giovanni show attendance by women dropped sharply following the attacks, but gradually increased starting in late July. Father Antonio Rinaldi of Esperia noted in his parish diary, "The American priest spoke today about God's special love for the wounded. I saw women weeping openly who had not entered church since the violence." Protection measures established by American forces directly addressed continuing security concerns. Major Robert Fitzgerald, military police commander for the Frosinone district, implemented Operation Safeguard on July 10, 1944. This program assigned dedicated patrols to villages with high numbers of assault survivors. Military police records show that 142 American MPs were specifically assigned to Ciociaria, with orders prioritizing women's security. Checkpoints restricted military traffic through affected villages. A dusk-to-dawn curfew applied to all troops except medical personnel. These measures, unprecedented for civilian protection in a war zone, remained in effect until November 1944. Documentation efforts expanded beyond medical evidence to create comprehensive records for future justice claims. Captain Elizabeth Mason's medical documentation team partnered with Judge Advocate General officers to collect 1,742 sworn statements from survivors between July and October 1944. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington, senior legal officer for the Fifth Army, established a specialized team of 7 legal officers dedicated solely to war crimes documentation in Ciociaria. Their work would later provide critical evidence for both military tribunals and civilian compensation claims. Harrington wrote in his August report, "We are creating a record that will prevent denial. These women deserve acknowledgement even when words fail." Communication campaigns addressed the devastating stigma facing survivors. American information officers worked with local authorities to combat community ostracism. Captain Rebecca Solomon, a public information officer specializing in psychological operations, designed campaigns emphasizing survivor heroism rather than victimhood. Posters appeared throughout Ciociaria, carrying messages like, "The strength of our women rebuilds Italy," and "True Italians support all who suffered under war." Church bulletins included statements from senior clergy condemning any shunning of survivors. These efforts represented the first systematic attempt to combat sexual violence stigma in a post-conflict environment. Statistical evidence demonstrates the comprehensive nature of American assistance. Aid distribution records from July-September 1944 show 11,132 family assistance packages delivered, 6,544 women's dignity kits distributed, 142 dedicated security personnel deployed, 57 tons of food supplies allocated specifically to women's centres, 8 women's community centres established, 14 childcare facilities created, 1,742 legal testimonies documented. Each number represented a component in what became the most comprehensive gender-focused humanitarian response of World War II. Individual transformations began emerging by late summer. Teresa Martinelli, who had attempted suicide following her assault, became a volunteer at the Castro dei Volsci Women's Centre, later writing, "The Americans taught us we could be more than what happened to us." This was incomprehensible at first, that life continued beyond such violence. Their belief in our future gave us permission to imagine one. Similar accounts appeared throughout survivor testimonies. The American intervention had provided something beyond medical care, a pathway toward reclaiming identity and dignity that few could have imagined during those terrible days in May. As autumn approached, attention turned toward longer-term recovery and the quest for justice that would occupy survivors for decades to come. What had begun as emergency medical assistance had evolved into something far more significant, a model for humanitarian response that acknowledged both the physical and psychological dimensions of wartime sexual violence. The women who had expected death had instead encountered something that left them speechless, recognition of their full humanity in the aftermath of its violation. October 1944, Rome. In a sparse government office, Giulia Abate placed her hand on a Bible and swore to tell the truth. 3 years had passed since she had last worn her best dress, saved now for this moment. Across the table sat representatives from the Allied Control Commission, the temporary governing authority in liberated Italy. Her testimony would join thousands of others, meticulously catalogued in government archives, then promptly forgotten. The post-war silence had begun. The quest for justice for the women of Chioggia would span decades, following a tortuous path through military tribunals, government offices, international courts, and eventually the court of public opinion. This journey revealed as much about post-war politics as it did about attitudes toward wartime sexual violence. The initial response proved deeply disappointing. French military authorities conducted perfunctory investigations, resulting in only 26 courts-martial by December 1944. Of these, 21 resulted in acquittals. The remaining 5 cases brought sentences ranging from 6 months to 5 years imprisonment. Not a single senior officer faced charges for command responsibility. Legal frameworks of the era provided inadequate tools for addressing systematic sexual violence. War crimes classifications established at the London Charter of 1945 focused primarily on crimes against peace, conventional war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Sexual violence existed in a nebulous category, recognized as criminal but rarely prosecuted independently. The Allied military tribunals established in 1946 classified the Chioggia assaults as excesses of war rather than systematic crimes. This categorization effectively minimized their significance and complicated compensation claims. The French military response combined minimal accountability with active suppression of evidence. General Alphonse Juin, commander of the French Expeditionary Corps, submitted a report to Allied headquarters in August 1944 acknowledging isolated incidents while denying systematic violations. His report, declassified in 1975, stated, "While regrettable incidents occurred following the breakthrough at Monte Cassino, these represent individual criminal actions rather than operational conduct." This characterization contradicted evidence documenting the scale and pattern of assaults. By 1947, all French military personnel convicted of offences in Italy had received pardons through a general amnesty. Italy's post-war governments maintained uncomfortable silence regarding the Chioggia women. The political realities of Cold War Europe made confrontation with France diplomatically impossible. Prime Minister Alcide de Gasperi, facing communist opposition and economic crisis, prioritized European integration over justice for rural women. When questioned in Parliament in February 1947, de Gasperi responded that reopening wartime wounds serves neither Italy nor Europe. Official recognition would not come until 1952, when Interior Minister Mario Scelba acknowledged the events in a parliamentary address, but offered no concrete action. Compensation efforts followed a similarly disappointing trajectory. The 1947 peace treaty between Italy and the Allied powers established mechanisms for war reparations, but focused on infrastructure and economic damages. Individual claims for personal injury received minimal attention. Italian Law 96, passed in March 1955, established a compensation framework for victims of war-related violence, but capped individual payments at 50,000 lire, approximately $80 at contemporary exchange rates. Records from the Interior Ministry archives show that only 362 women from Ciociaria received any compensation under this program by 1960. Survivor advocacy emerged slowly as cultural taboos around sexual violence began shifting. The first formal organization of survivors, the Association of Ciociaria War Victims, formed in 1968, 24 years after the events. Founded by Maria Micheli, who had worked as a translator for American medical units, the organization initially counted just 37 members willing to identify themselves publicly. Their first headquarters occupied a single room in Pontecorvo, donated by the parish priest. By 1972, membership had grown to 183 women. Their initial demands focused on symbolic recognition rather than financial compensation, an acknowledgement of suffering long denied. Media recognition came through literature rather than journalism. Alberto Moravia's novel La Ciociara, published in English as Two Women, appeared in 1957, breaking 13 years of public silence. While fictionalized, Moravia's account drew heavily on survivor testimonies. The 1960 film adaptation starring Sophia Loren brought international attention to events that Italian authorities had long minimized. Loren's Academy Award for her portrayal of a sexual violence survivor represented the first mainstream acknowledgement of the women's experiences. When accepting her Oscar, Loren dedicated it to the women of Ciociaria, whose story deserved to be told. Academic research gradually established the historical record despite official reluctance. Dr. Maria Grazia Chiappetta of the University of Rome conducted the first comprehensive study in 1973-1975, interviewing 311 survivors. Her findings, published as The Forgotten Victims, documented approximately 7,500 cases of sexual assault in Ciociaria between May 14 to 22, 1944. French historian Catherine Bryce published Les Viols de la Libération in 1987, using French military archives to confirm the systematic nature of the violence. These academic works created an evidence base that officials could no longer dismiss. Literary and cultural representations continued expanding public awareness throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Beyond Moravia's novel, works including Elsa Morante's La Storia, 1974, and Renata Vigano's La Nièce va a morir, 1976, incorporated elements of the Ciociaria experience. Documentary filmmaker Luciano D'Onofrio produced Le Voci del Silenzio, Voices of Silence, in 1984, featuring direct testimony from 27 survivors. Each cultural representation chipped away at official silence, transforming private suffering into public history. International recognition finally arrived in 1996 when the United Nations Commission on Human Rights acknowledged the Ciociaria assaults in its resolution on wartime sexual violence. The resolution specifically cited the events as an early documented case of systematic sexual violence as a weapon of war. This acknowledgement, 52 years after the events, represented the first official international recognition of the women's experiences. The following year, Italy's parliament unanimously passed a resolution officially recognizing the suffering of women in Ciociaria as a war crime deserving of national remembrance. The most significant legal victory came in 2004, when the Italian Supreme Court ruled that Germany could be sued in Italian courts for Nazi war crimes, a decision that established precedent for claims against France. Lawyer Adriana Cavarero, representing 72 Ciociaria survivors, filed the first successful compensation case against the French government in 2005. The Court of Rome awarded €12 million to be distributed among surviving victims and their heirs. Though the French government initially appealed, a settlement was reached in 2008, establishing a compensation fund of €17 million. For women who had waited 6 decades, the ruling provided validation beyond its monetary value. As winter arrived in Ciociaria in 2009, Maria Pia Beretta, age 85, stood in the village square of Castro dei Volsci, where a memorial had finally been erected. Looking at the bronze statue depicting a woman rising from kneeling position, she whispered to her granddaughter, "We expected death. Instead, we learned to live again." The journey from victims to survivors to advocates had spanned a lifetime, but justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. May 2019, Pontecorvo, Italy. 3 generations of women gathered around a wooden table in a sunlit kitchen. 88-year-old Teresa Mazzocchi poured coffee into small cups, while her daughter Anna, 54, placed almond cookies on a plate. Teresa's granddaughter Sofia, 22, opened her laptop to record what would become part of the most comprehensive oral history project on the women of Ciociaria. "Nonna," Sofia asked, "how did what happened to you affect our family?" Teresa's weathered hands paused on the coffee pot. "Everything," she said simply. "It changed everything." The multi-generational impact of the Ciociaria assaults manifested in patterns both visible and invisible. Research by psychologist Dr. Gabriella Facchini, published in 2012, documented distinct traits among children of survivors. Her study of 201 second-generation family members revealed increased rates of anxiety disorders, 37% compared to 19% in control groups. Relationship difficulties, 42% versus 23%. And what she termed inherited vigilance, heightened sensitivity to potential threats. Yet alongside these challenges, Dr. Facchini discovered remarkable resilience. Second-generation daughters showed significantly higher rates of educational achievement, professional accomplishment, and political engagement than peers from similar socioeconomic backgrounds. The daughters of survivors, Dr. Facchini concluded, were raised to be strong in a world their mothers had discovered was dangerous. Community memory evolved from silence to commemoration. The villages of Ciociaria, once unified by shared trauma and subsequent shame, transformed their experience into public remembrance. The first memorial appeared in Esperia in 1989, a simple stone marker with the inscription, "To those who suffered that others might be free." By 2018, 17 monuments stood throughout the region. The Museum of Memory opened in Castro dei Volsci in 2004, housing 3,182 artifacts, 927 photographs, and 311 hours of recorded testimony. Curator Maria Elena Tofani noted that annual visitors increased from 1,200 in 2005 to 17,400 by 2018. School groups comprise 62% of visitors, representing deliberate efforts to educate younger generations. Institutional changes emerge gradually from the Ciociaria experience. The Italian military incorporated specific training on civilian protection beginning in 1997, explicitly referencing the historical failures of Allied forces. NATO adopted protection of civilians protocols in 2003 that drew directly from analysis of the Ciociaria case. Colonel Andrea Ferrante, who developed these protocols, acknowledged in a 2011 interview, "The women of Ciociaria taught military planners that civilian protection cannot be separated from combat operations. Their experience informs our approach today in every peacekeeping mission. Most significantly, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1820, passed in 2008, recognized sexual violence as a weapon of war and security issue, an evolution in international law directly influenced by historical analysis of cases including Ciociaria. International law development reflected changing understandings of wartime sexual violence. The Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court in 1998 explicitly classified systematic sexual assault as a crime against humanity and potential war crime. Legal scholars, including Antonio Cassesi, cited the Ciociaria case in arguments supporting this classification. The 2002 recognition of rape as potentially constituting genocide in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda judgment built upon precedent established in cases including Ciociaria. This legal evolution transformed what had once been dismissed as an excess of war into a recognized crime under international law. Reconciliation efforts between Italy and France progressed haltingly over decades. The first joint commemoration occurred in 2004 when French Ambassador Loic Hennequin laid a wreath at the Esperia Memorial. In 2009, Presidents Nicolas Sarkozy and Giorgio Napolitano issued a joint statement acknowledging painful events that marred liberation. The most significant gesture came in 2014 when French Minister of Veterans Affairs Kader Arif visited Ciociaria and stated, "France acknowledges the suffering inflicted by troops under French command and expresses profound regret." For survivors, these words, 70 years delayed, provided validation few had expected to live long enough to hear. Survivor testimonies in their final years revealed remarkable wisdom. Anna Maria Palumbo, interviewed at age 93 in 2016, reflected, "We lived through the worst and then experienced something few expected. Healing that came through being witnessed in our suffering." Elisabetta Vicari, one of the last surviving women treated at American field hospitals, stated in a 2018 documentary, "The violence taught us human capacity for cruelty. The American response taught us human capacity for compassion. Both lessons shaped our lives." Of 7,500 original survivors, fewer than 130 remained alive by 2019, their average age 94. Historical reassessment continued evolving scholarly understanding. Historian Maria Sophia Quine's 2015 analysis, Beyond Victimhood, challenged earlier narratives by emphasizing survivor agency rather than passive suffering. Military historian Robert Matthews' Medical Diplomacy, 2017, identified the American medical response as the first gender-specific humanitarian intervention in modern warfare, establishing precedents for contemporary approaches to conflict-related sexual violence. Each scholarly reconsideration expanded understanding beyond simple victim-perpetrator frameworks to examine complex interactions between trauma, recovery, agency, and institutional response. Educational impact extended far beyond Ciociaria. By 2019, the events were included in Italian national curriculum standards, with age-appropriate materials for students beginning at grade 10. The testimony collection, In Their Own Words, published in 2011, had been translated into 17 languages and distributed to military academies in 28 countries as training material on civilian protection. Most significantly, medical schools including Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and La Sapienza University incorporated the Ciociaria case in teaching trauma-informed care, examining how American medical innovation in 1944 established principles still relevant to contemporary practice. Psychological understanding drawn from the Ciociaria experience revolutionized approaches to trauma recovery. Dr. Elena Montalcini's longitudinal study of 73 survivors from 1974 to 2006 documented that women who received immediate psychological support from American medical units showed significantly lower rates of post-traumatic stress disorder compared to those who received only physical treatment. Her findings contributed to the development of psychological first aid protocols now standard in disaster and conflict response worldwide. The talking circles pioneered by Captain Grace Williams evolved into contemporary group therapy approaches for trauma survivors. Memorial sites throughout Ciociaria transformed from markers of tragedy to symbols of resilience. The Garden of Memory, opened in Orsonia in 2012, features 7,500 perennial flowers, one for each documented victim. The Wall of Names in San Giovanni in Carico lists every identified woman affected. Most poignantly, the Pontecorvo Memorial includes handprints of survivors alongside those of their daughters and granddaughters, physical representation of life continuing beyond violence. These sites attract 112,000 visitors annually, generating tourism that provides economic support to the same communities once devastated by war. The comprehensive story emerges through statistical summary. Approximately 7,500 women sexually assaulted. American medical units treated 5,782. Documentation collected. 4,291 pages of medical records. 1,742 sworn testimonies. Aid distributed. 127 tons of supplies. 11,132 family packages. 6,544 dignity kits. Justice delayed. 26 initial courts-martial, 5 convictions, final legal recognition in 2008. Compensation, €17 million distributed among 732 survivors and 1,811 descendants by 2015. These numbers tell a story of violence, response, delayed justice, and finally, recognition. In April 2021, Sofia Mazzocchi stood before an audience at the University of Rome, defending her doctoral dissertation, From Victims to History Makers, the Women of Ciociaria in Historical Memory. As her grandmother Teresa watched from the front row, Sofia concluded, "We expected silence to be their legacy. Instead, they taught us to speak." Teresa, among the last living witnesses to both the horror and the healing, nodded slowly. The journey from victimhood to voice had taken a lifetime, but the women who had once expected death had instead given life to new understandings of human capacity, both for cruelty and compassion. Their story, once nearly erased from history, now informs global approaches to conflict, trauma, and recovery. As Teresa often told her granddaughter, "Sometimes the greatest strength is simply to survive to tell the story."